I've just watched an interesting online lecture in the form of a YouTube video entitled The Patriarchy Paradox. This is by a guy called Will Knowland, who is a lecturer at Eton. Eton is one of Britain's best known public schools, which in this country is not how it sounds, it's quite an elite school. But this is a place that's produced 20 prime ministers, so it's a pretty famous institution. Anyway, this has attracted controversy because of the circumstances around Will Nolan being dismissed from Eton as a result of this lecture. And I'm going to talk a bit about the lecture itself, but just firstly a bit from the Daily Mail article. Now, quick word about the Daily Mail. It's certainly not my paper of choice. You know, I could think of many reasons to criticize the Daily Mail, and definitely it is prone to clickbait and sensationalism without question. So I'm not holding the Daily Mail up here as gospel. However, some of the points they raise, some of the aspects of this do warrant discussion. So this is the headline, and the report is by Sarah Oliver for the Mail on Sunday. 800 Etonians in revolt after teacher is sacked for questioning radical feminist dogma on masculinity, inverted commas, as war on woke hits Britain's top school. That's obviously her words or the Daily Mail's words. Worth pointing out, by the way, journalists don't always get to choose the headline, which is something I've discovered in my course. Anyway, Will Nolan taught English at the 42,500 a year Berkshire School for 9 years. Mr. Nolan said he was dismissed over a lesson titled The Patriarchy Paradox. It was made as a virtual lecture to be put on the internet, but was never aired. That I assume means was never aired in the school itself, because it is aired on YouTube. It hasn't been taken down there. I've just watched it. Headmaster Simon Henderson dismissed Mr. Nolan for gross misconduct. So this is a bit more context. I'm not going to read out the whole report, but as always, I'll put a link to the report as well as the lecture itself. It said that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. 2 centuries later, Britain's most venerable school has become a battleground on the war on of the in the war, excuse me, in the war on woke. On one side is English teacher Will Knowland, who was fired after standing up for his belief that students need to hear a broad range of opinions. On the other is Headmaster Simon Henderson, who sacked him for gross misconduct amid the fallout from a lecture about the nature of masculinity. Hundreds of pupils and members of the wider Eton community have now accused the school of hypocrisy, cruelty, and a complete lack of backbone, and asked if Eton was protecting its new image as politically progressive at the expense of one of its own. In a petition supporting Mr. Nolan, they said young men and their views are formed in the meeting and conflict of ideas, which necessarily entails controversy and its spirited discussion. Mr. Knowland, they add, is loved by all who have encountered him, and the students feel morally bound not to be bystanders in what appears to be an instance of institutional bullying. It's a plea of such erudition that any English teacher, not just one in a politically correct pickle, would be delighted to know his students had written. It may not, however, be sufficient to save him. Um, and that's just a bit more background about Eton itself. Um, okay, a niche knuckle dragging opinion. This is referring to that's the fact that science and history offer evidence that masculine virtues such as strength and courage can be beneficial to women, the family, and society. A niche knuckle-dragging opinion? Hardly. While it might be considered provocative to some, it is part of mainstream thinking. Mr. Nolan believed Eton's boys had the right to balance in a curriculum he felt had become dangerously skewed. Suicide is the biggest killer of young men, and I suspect this jaundiced view of masculinity, currently so fashionable, is partly responsible, he wrote privately to colleagues after a short dismissal. And just scroll down to the point. Yeah, here we go. One member of staff, one, complained about the lecture, alleging it amounted to harassment in the workplace and was illegal under the Equality Act. It's not. That person was said to be particularly upset that Mr. Noland was asking students to consider the idea that in a world without any men, it might be worse for women. The head sided with the complainant. There could hardly be a better example of how the toxic diversity rows which have Within Britain's higher education institutions are now heading for the country's high schools, and not just Eton, which has educated 20 British Prime Ministers and the Duke of Cambridge. For Mr. Knowland, those battles are no longer theoretical but harsh reality. He is the father of 5 children, one of whom is disabled. He and his wife Rachel live in a grace and favour detached 4 bedroom house owned by Eton. If he fails to win back his job and appeal that next month, they will be homeless. So there's real world implications of this. Nor does he have the kind of family fortune enjoyed by the majority of pupils at the 42,500 a year school to soften his fall. He is from a modest background, educated in an independent school on a 100% bursary, and that's just more about his background. But anyway, the report gives a lot of context there. But apparently, what's happened here is that he refused on principle to take down this lecture from YouTube. It's important to say YouTube itself hasn't removed it. But the principal, Mr. Henderson, has basically given him this ultimatum 6 times to take it down because he refused to do so. That was the grounds for his dismissal. Now, if that isn't censorship, I don't know what is. Um, and I don't buy any sort of argument that it was only a temporary procedure to until the complaints were settled. Because anyone that's uploaded a video, as I have, you'll know that you can't upload something and take it down, then just upload it fresh again. That's not how it works. I mean, maybe you could give the lecture again, but aside from the inconvenience, it's the principle of taking that down. It amounts to censorship. So, what was this offending lecture in question? Was it some sort of misogynistic diatribe? Not nothing of the sort. What he done in the lecture, and I'm not going to go through every nuance. It's 33 minutes long. It's pretty watchable. It's quite compact. It's very interesting, I found, engaging. It's not slow, but what he does basically is look at history and science to counter the argument that patriarchy is bad for women, and he makes a lot of interesting points that I hadn't even considered before, or points that aren't often brought up in this debate, even between feminists and their critics. For example, about when we look at athletes, the fact that studies have shown that male athletes perform even stronger when they believe women are watching. And this gets back to an ancient concept of the hunter-gatherer protector instinct. That is, women value men perceived to be physically stronger. Um, there's a fundamental contradiction in the feminist argument because they say that patriarchy is bad for women, it keeps women down, and it's a way for men to control women. Yet the same feminists concede that in such situations as domestic violence, society as a whole, men and women, are going to be far, far more judgmental of a man who abuses a woman than a man who abuses a more vulnerable man. I mean, when we talk about the issue of domestic abuse, sometimes, and this is my own thought here, sometimes there's a retort that, from critics of feminism, well, what about lesbian couples who might be abusive to one another? That's interesting, but here's another thought. What about homosexual men, where you might have one abusive partner? The wider society isn't going to lose a lot of sleep over that. They're not going to lose a lot of sleep over a more dominant man abusing his boyfriend. But if you get a well-built guy who's using his wife or girlfriend as a punching bag, society is understandably going to be outraged. And that is understandable. I am, right? I mean, my natural response to that is that's terrible. Um, so there's a contradiction in the feminist argument because they are actually acknowledging the male protective role, the very same role which they then criticize in other circumstances because they assert that it is part of male control. Um, he also quoted Andrea Dworkin, who I didn't realize this was quoted in glowing terms as recently as 2019. No doubt by The Guardian, he didn't say that, but Andrea Dworkin, some of her views really, even many moderate feminists would find her extreme. Um, But there's a lot of points that he makes which men's rights activists often bring up, for example, about the fact that the most dangerous jobs are occupied by men. There's always been a unique pressure on men in times of war. And that is to say that whilst there are countries that recruit women, for example, Israel and Russia when it had conscription, apparently, I didn't realize this, in the First Chechen War in 1994, Russian women officers refused to go and they weren't made to go, but men did, and a lot of young Russian men died in Chechnya. Um, so, in times of war, there has always been a unique pressure on men. Um, and this is something that comes about from the physical expectations of men, but also demographic trends. The fact that men have historically been seen as disposable because men cannot bear children, therefore they're not creating new life in that sense. That's that's one way to look at it. But if you look at the lecture, he's a lot more elaborate in discussing these issues than I am. I've just scratched the surface. It's a very interesting lecture. It's worth looking at. But I do not see anything in that that can reasonably be seen as misogynistic. Of course, it's controversial. Of course, it's provocative. Whenever you challenge ideas or movements, that's always going to be provocative. But I'm inclined to think, with the information that's available, that I agree with the Daily Mail on this occasion, or rather that the way the students have perceived this, that this principle is just caved in to woke dogma, that because a lecturer has dared to question feminism and dared to question their arguments about what the patriarchy is and its effect on women, then he must be sacrificed. Um, if you have time, it's 33 minutes long. Like I say, it flows quite well. Watch it soon because it might well be taken down by YouTube. It hasn't yet, but the way things are these days, it might well be. Um, as for whether or not it broke equality legislation, I'm not a legal expert. I don't know if it did or didn't. If it did, that would be very alarming because it would be an example of how that legislation is abused. The idea that simply questioning feminist arguments is a cause for censorship, that is deeply, deeply alarming. I think in a free society, no idea, no movement should be above criticism, none, or scrutiny. So if you get a chance, check out the lecture. It's very interesting. He raises a lot of points, like I say, a lot more elaborately than I have. I've just scratched the surface. But